All right, everybody, and welcome to the screencast. What I wanted to do now was try to follow up on Dave's webinar where he talked about fixing an antique photo or an old photo. And I just want to show you here in the webcam, I've got this one here. And you can notice immediately, if I do that, all that glare. And that was really challenging to take the picture. I didn't really know how I was going to handle that. And it's kind of a full back here, so I didn't want to take it apart. There's just no way. I mean, it's just too old. I want to ruin it, and I want to keep it in the frame. But I did want to digitize the image. And so that was definitely a challenge. Then when we watched Dave Cross's webinar, I was happy to see this great trick he showed, which was to first take a picture of the image on an angle so I could reduce the amount of glare as possible. So I did do that here. You can see this is what I came up with, just kind of leaning it up against a couple of boxes I had in the office and pushed it back. Now, I do notice, and it's going to become more apparent because I did test this, but you'll see I do have some reflection and some glare I just didn't get rid of, and I'll fix that here as we go through the screencast. So let's get started here and make the Photoshop magic happen. I do have my crop tool selected here, the perspective crop tool. So we're just going to bring this back flat on. So instead of having that glare, we're going to bring this back on. Now, Dave drew out in the webinar, you can draw out this perspective crop tool and then adjust your edges to wherever you want. That actually worked really well. But one other little neat trick here is that before you drag out, you can actually click down with this tool. So I'm going to click the corners. Each one of these corners, I'm just going to click once. Don't hold down. And then as you draw this line, it'll start to work. So I'm going to click down there. I'm going to click over here. Okay, right to that corner. And then I'll click up here. And you can still adjust it, but I kind of like that it's just sort of doing that for me automatically. That looks great. And then I can just hit the check mark up here, just double click. And then there you go.
Something this, and also want to take advantage of an ability to adjust for the lens I have, but you'll see this is going to create transparency, which is a bit of a problem. So I'm going to open that image now in Photoshop, and you can see there's just these transparent areas. So in this case, it's not really the distraction that we're trying to remove is the fact that it's see-through, and it shouldn't be. So let's try and see what happens if we do content aware fill. So I'm going to use the shortcut for fill, content aware, click OK. And it's going to think about it. And didn't do such a good job because when it looked nearby, it said, well, I'll just use these pixels. So it repeated the corner of the rooftop in there, which I don't want. And one of the things with content aware fill is you always have the option of undoing and trying again, undoing and trying again. But the reality we have to live with here is that content aware fill is looking at surrounding pixels. And sometimes the pixels that are surrounding are not the ones you want. So here's a wonderful little trick that I've used so many times in the last few years. It's saved my life a number of times. What you do is make a very just basic kind of loose selection around any areas that you don't want content aware fill to use. So something like this. And then we're going to add a layer mask. Now, by nature, when you add a layer mask in Photoshop, it's going to keep whatever's selected and hide the rest. We want the opposite to happen. We want to hide the selection. So we do that by holding down Option or Alt and clicking on the Add Layer Mask button. Now you can see the entire church is hidden. Now, if I go back to my church layer, make a selection again, and do content aware fill, what should happen is it should do a better job now because it can't use the church because it's not there. So now look at that, it did a pretty nice job. Now there's this whole side over here, so let's try this side and see what happens. Does its thinking. It looks pretty good, and then all we need to do is throw the layer mask away. And when you do that and delete it, there we go. We got the rest of the photograph back.
Change the blending mode because I want to get a tight or general sort of selection on what I'm seeing here. That way I can move it around. So let's see. Magic wand. Here we go. Let's select everything that's black. All right, that will do just fine for this. I'm going to invert what I have with Command-Shift-I, and that will invert that selection. Okay, so I have a selection of this, and now I'm going to make a mask. And this is going to be before I turn into a smart object, and you'll see why in a second here. So I'm going to add my mask here with that selection. Here we go. I'm going to turn this into a smart object. And now, with this as a smart object, which I can always double click and edit, and right, here's that mask, right? Nothing was destroyed here. That's the beauty of smart objects there. I'm going to change the blending mode now to screen. Okay, now what this allows me to do, I have basically what I had before, only now if I go to the Puppet Warp tool, this will allow me to click and make these little pins here that I can then control and bend and have it do whatever I want. It is completely at your will. If you want things more stretched out there, and since it's just a streak of light, it's really not going to do much as far as, you know, the quality wise. It's going to be whatever it's going to be. So now if I have this and I wanted to add that, what's great, again, because it's a smart object, is this non-destructive. So once I realize, like, wow, that looks terrible, I can double click that Puppet Warp and look, those pins are still there. So I can go back and change my mind because clearly it needed to do this. I don't know, right? So you sort of pick what it needed to do, and then you can hit checkbox and change your mind as much as possible.
So here's this pelican. You can get an idea again of what I did here. So let me show you the original right now. So here's the original photo. Kind of a flat light type of day. There isn't a lot of direct sun. You can see there's a kind of cloudy. And so what's going through my mind is, well, how do I pull out the detail? How do I pull out the texture and get some pop and vibrance back into this? So here's the resulting image. You can see what I've done here again, starting with my my four main things: highlights down, shadows up, clarity up, and vibrance up. Those four things are almost a staple. In fact, if we go here to the lower left-hand corner, these are my presets, and so I just click on that a lot of times, and voila. This photo needed a couple more things. Exposure, I needed to brighten it up, because if we go back to that original photo, you can see it's a little bit dark. And then I also brought my blacks down. And I think I bring my blacks down, I would say, on 25% of my photos, because a lot of photos look really good if you have a solid black. It's kind of the foundation of your image, if there's a nice solid black. So I'll experiment with that sometimes by bringing my blacks down. And what that does here for this bird is it makes those feathers deep in between the feathers turn black, and that's a good thing. So
that's amazing.
Go ahead.
Let me ask a question real quick. So when you're out there shooting and you see an image like this, like the original is what would come out of my camera, right? So I would, well, maybe if I'm lucky, but let's just say that's what comes out of the camera. And you can start looking at these in Lightroom, and you get in there, and you might feel discouraged when you see an image like that.
Yeah.
If you don't know how to develop the image in Lightroom, which is what we're learning here. Is that something you ever think about anymore? Are you ever discouraged when you see a photo, or do you always think, you know what, I can develop this?
You know, that's a really great question. Because a lot of times when you start out in photography, you have this mindset or this image, this future image in mind, like, oh my gosh, you know, we'll use a lion, for example. There's a lion and it's on a thing, and there's an animal and it's in the Serengeti, and in your mind, the experience, the adrenaline is kind of overpowering the reality of the situation. So you take your photo and then you get back to your laptop or your desktop and you start working on it, and it doesn't achieve what you had expected mentally. So over time, the more you photograph and the more you process, the more those two worlds will come together. Your expectation in the real world will end up matching what you know you can do in Photoshop and Lightroom.